Welcome and thank you for joining today. We are excited to have you here as part of our Pathlock Innovation Series. This is our last session for the day on our Oracle Innovation Day, and we're excited to have our presenters here from Protiviti. The presentation today is Demystifying Oracle Cloud Licensing, Common Blind Spots, and How to Get Ahead. Our presenters today are Ashley Dang and Ryan Briscoe, and they will introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. If you have any audio issues, click on Preferences and then Audio. From there, you can check to see if you're using the appropriate audio device. You can also click the play sound to check if the sound is coming through your speakers. This presentation will take approximately 40 minutes, and there will be a Q&A session following the presentation, so we encourage you to put some questions in the question box for our speakers to answer at the end of the event. And with that, I'll turn the time over to our speakers to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Dang. I am a manager at Protiviti, based out of the Houston, Texas office within our Enterprise Application Solutions practice. My 3-year milestone here at Protiviti has recently passed, so most of my work has been in the Oracle EBS and cloud space with a focus on application security and implementation support.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Briscoe. Looking forward to the presentation today. I'm a manager out of our Atlanta office. Been with Protiviti around 6 years, also in our Enterprise Application Solutions group, and most of my time has been spent around Oracle GRC and Oracle Security and Controls. Back to you, Natalie.
Good stuff. All right, so in today's presentation, we are going to be discussing Oracle Cloud Licensing. So it's not a new concept, but we've recently seen and worked with more and more of our Oracle customers that are having challenges and need our help understanding, one, how licenses are actually triggered to identify what they're currently using based on what they've contractually and intentionally signed up for. And number two, how they could be unknowingly tapping into modules or services they didn't set out to purchase. That's what we call unexpected usage. So in today's webinar, we're going to primarily focus on the latter point that I just made, which is unexpected usage. So we'll discuss how customers can identify this usage using some resources that are provided by Oracle, and we'll walk through a hypothetical scenario to quantify unexpected usage and share with you all how that potentially translates into dollars on an invoice. We'll also share some of the most common root causes that we've seen customers may not be aware of that are triggering unexpected usage. And then finally, we'll touch on the importance of preventing long-term leakage through more disciplined governance processes. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan, who will familiarize or maybe reorient some of you to the Oracle Cloud Security model.
Sure. Thank you, Natalie. You'll see on the screen here, we have a graphic at a high level describing the Oracle Cloud security model. I'll dig into the details at a high level, and then we'll move on into how that impacts licensing. So at the core of the Oracle Cloud security model, you have the user account. So the user account, just like any other system, is your source of record. On top of a user account, you assign a job role. And so when you think job role, think back to your EBS days. That's more like a responsibility. It's a bucket of functional access that's intended to represent a job function, hence the name job role. Below the job role, there exists what we call duty roles, which are more task-based sub-roles, and that's where individual privileges are assigned that allow a user to view and transact on specific forms, pages, processes, reports, etc. Again, kind of taking it back to an EBS example, this would be similar from the duty role perspective to a menu, and then from the privilege perspective to a function. Outside of that primary way of assigning access to a user, there's also the concept of abstract roles. So abstract roles are standalone roles with corresponding privileges that provide access rights that augment user profiles. So thinking like an employee role for self-service functionalities, or a line manager role for supervisor approval workflow functionality. And these kind of sit outside the traditional access model, but still have privilege access assigned from the role perspective. There's also the concepts of data access. I'm not going to dig into this super granular because it can be a bit confusing, but I will touch on it at a high level. Basically, data access is managed through what we call role data access policies and user data access assignments. A data access policy is kind of like a where clause. It's limiting the scope and the type of database resources that you can access via a role. In addition to that, you then assign specific values of those database resources to a user, and that kind of scopes what the user can see at the role level and then what corresponding data access they have access to within that role. For now, like I said, I'll leave the data access kind of off the table because the role and privilege access is most pertinent to the licensing discussion. So that said, I think we can move on to the next slide. So now we're going to talk to some common misconceptions when speaking about licensing. And first, I'll just kind of give an overview of what some of those common misconceptions are. We can move on to the next slide. Awesome. So gone are the days of kind of simply buying a bucket of headcount from a licensing perspective and assuming you're covered as an organization, that you're going to stay within the parameters of what you bought. The way it works now, Oracle's licensing model is somewhat complex. It's primarily driven off of what security access a user has via their job roles and corresponding privilege access they're assigned. And we are seeing that the majority of our customers are actively being monitored by Oracle on a monthly basis, and that this quote licensing driven by privilege is being enforced from a compliance perspective. So just taking it back and thinking more broadly, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking kind of how could this pose an impact to my organization? It really starts at the bottom with the concept of job roles that are seeded or they are provided by Oracle by default out of the box. Many organizations choose to use these out of the box roles that Oracle provides because they usually give you quick implementation times, and they generally have the use cases that the business needs to do day-to-day operations. So that kind of allows the business to kind of get going quickly when they ramp up with Oracle. The issue though is that these out of the box roles are known to have broad-based access. So even though each role by naming convention somewhat aligns with a particular module, Oracle usually gives them a variety of other privilege access to other modules just because there may be common business process use cases where a user would need to hop into other modules, maybe view a subledger somewhere else, et cetera. And that would make it easier just to kind of bundle that all into that role. Although it's not necessarily intuitive, regardless of whether you subscribe or don't subscribe to a module that a job role has access to, you still trigger a license if there's a privilege assigned that corresponds to that module. So again, just thinking bigger picture here, usually those out of the box job roles do have excessive access. So they have excessive access across modules that you may or may not be considering. You're likely triggering licenses across those modules as well. One other point around the concept of out of the box roles from Oracle, I'm just kind of putting on my audit hat from years past. They often tend to have excessive SOD risk as well. So although it's not directly related to licensing, that's just another thing to consider if you're using out of the box job roles. You're likely impacting your risk posture significantly by using those in addition to licensing impacts. So then moving on, so what if you're an organization, right, that you've already customized roles because you knew you weren't supposed to be using the out of the box roles, or maybe that wasn't a good way of phrasing it. Maybe you knew that it wasn't best for your organization from a risk or license perspective. Should you still be concerned with licensing? The general answer is yes, and that's just based on our experience. Usually from a best practice system implementation perspective, you would take an out of the box role, copy it, and then customize from there. And so basically when a system implementer usually does that, they would only take out what is required from a business requirements perspective to meet the need of the business, and they usually leave a lot of residual privileges in there. And by design, since out of the box roles normally have excessive access across a plethora of modules, any residual privileges that are left in are still likely triggering licensing. And then again, one more time, tying it back to the SOD perspective and the audit perspective, If you've customized your roles and you've already built them to be, quote, clean from a segregation of duties perspective, you shouldn't necessarily assume that that means you're clean or within appropriate bounds from a licensing perspective. And that alludes to what I just said. And also just from a risk perspective, often when you go in and clean up your role design for segregation of duties purposes, you'll leave in a lot of benign privileges that don't have any risk impact, but that does not mean that they do not have a license impact if they sit in a module that, where it will trigger a license for that module. So that's just another angle to consider when you're thinking through whether or not you're using those custom roles and if you should still be concerned with licensing and SOD risk. Moving on, so I just described several of the general misconceptions you're seeing on the screen here. Just to touch on a couple more, some common misconceptions we see starting number one with inquiry-only roles. Basically, from an inquiry-only perspective, if you assign a role that's only inquiry-only, you would assume that from a transaction perspective, since you can't perform anything, you likely wouldn't be triggering a license if you are in a module and only viewing things. That is not the case. Any inquiry-only role does trigger a license if you can get into a certain navigation and view from a privileged perspective things within those modules where they trigger licenses. The second point I wanted to talk to is around licensing triggering only when you're interacting with the intended module or product. So it's a fallacy to think that if you're in a module and you're not actively navigating to a privilege that triggers a corresponding license authorization, that you probably aren't actually triggering that. That's not true. As long as the role is assigned to you and within that role the privilege exists that triggers said license, you're actively triggering or authorizing the license as long as it's provisioned to your user. Next thing I wanted to touch on is around inactive users. So this one's fairly counterintuitive. When I say inactive users, if you're at the user record in the security console and viewing it, there's a checkbox where you can activate or deactivate a user. It's not necessarily deleting a user. If you have the user set to inactive, you can assume that the user cannot get into the system and do anything. So it's more or less restricting their access and cutting their account off, but not deleting it. It may be common sense that that would not trigger licenses. That's not the case. As long as roles are assigned to that inactive user, any privileges under that role across modules where they trigger and authorize licenses will still authorize those licenses as long as the roles are provisioned to the user, regardless of whether they're active or not. Moving on, I also wanted to talk to abstract roles. I know I just talked to all the out-of-the-box job roles from Oracle, but abstract roles like the employee role and line manager role are still pertinent to the license conversation because they do still have privileges assigned to them. So the employee role is a good example. You would think that since it's more of an augmented role and it's fairly basic in nature, it wouldn't trigger excessive licensing, and that's not necessarily the case. Just to name a few, I know the employee role triggers procurement, AP, and HCM licenses out of the box, and that's just to name a couple. Another common theme is around production support. So a lot of times clients will, as part of an implementation, leave production support or elevated production support live with appropriate IT or managed service providers as part of hypercare, or just, if it's part of routine managed service, you may leave your managed service individuals with elevated access. That way, if you call them up and they need to come fix something, they can. That is going to cause licensing authorization as long as their elevated access is assigned. So given the nature of their access, it's likely to be broad-based, and it's likely to trigger a broad base of license authorizations as long as that elevated access is assigned. So something to think through if you could do more of a point-in-time break-fix provisioning model. Two other things I want to touch on. So one around the idea that you're probably only getting charged for modules that are in your bill of materials that you purchased. That is not a true statement. If you have access provision via role and privilege access that goes outside of the modules or SKUs that you purchased. And Natalie will kind of talk to that in more detail here in a minute on how you can investigate some of that. But basically, just don't make the assumption that just because you bought X, Y, and Z modules that you're only going to trigger X, Y, and Z module licenses, because that's not the case. And then the last point I wanted to bring up was just around the fact that, now that you're aware of this, you may think that, oh, it's a simple license conversation. You should be able to identify where your overage is fairly easily, and then intuitively plan to remediate any issues you have. I'm not going to say that's not the case, but often we find that given the reports that are available from Oracle, they don't necessarily paint the picture of how to tie the user, role, and privilege silos together in order to plan and bucket your overage issues into appropriate plans of action. So just something to think about. With that being said, like I mentioned, Natalie's going to go into a little bit more around the ROI and also around how we typically go through an assessment. So I will turn it back over to her.
Thanks, Ryan. So he's did a really good job at covering the common misconceptions and beliefs around licenses and how they are or are not triggered, but we can get into how unexpected usage is identified through what we call a license assessment. So like I said, cloud licensing, not a new concept, but the gap that we're noticing is that many customers, they're just not quite sure how to tie out what they're using or what's considered usage to what they're being charged. And they're also not aware that licenses can be triggered for services that they haven't purchased, referencing Ryan's point. Just because you have something on your bill of materials doesn't mean that's all you're going to be charged for. So sometimes they need help understanding and pinpointing unexpected usage. It's not unusual for this to go unnoticed or fly under the radar, because typically what we've seen, invoices, they're sent to the AP department, and there's really not a reconciliation activity taking place. So when we talk about unexpected usage, what exactly are we referring to? We're talking about the number of individuals that are authorized to access certain services based on the security access they have. So the operative word here is authorized. You can be authorized access to a service, but you may not actually log in and use it, but you'll still be charged for it. So how can you actually quantify the number of users that are authorized to use services? There's a report that's produced monthly, and it's provided by Oracle. So as a customer, you would have access to pull it yourself. It's actually in one of the system admin consoles. The exact name escapes me, but we definitely have some instructions. If you're curious, feel free to reach out to me or Ryan. But the report is the SaaS Service Usage Metrics Report. It's kind of a mouthful. But this report captures the number of hosted name users, which in simplest of terms, it's really just an individual that's authorized to access a hosted service, whether or not they're actively accessing that service. So I could be authorized to access it, but maybe I didn't actually use it, still counts towards a license. So the report captures the number of users for services that you would have active subscriptions for. We would call that your expected usage. At the time of contract, you thought you would use these services, you signed up for it, you've already expected usage here. But it'll also capture services that you've authorized users for that you don't have any active subscriptions for. Again, that's going back to our unexpected usage. So I just want to direct your eyes to the right hand portion of this slide. That screenshot is an example of the SaaS Service Usage Metrics Report. It's a snippet of the unexpected usage portion, and it'll show you how it's documented and reported. So each service you'll see has a corresponding part number or a SKU, and the number of the hosted name users to access that respective service is going to be documented for the past 3 months. Also on the far right hand column where it says highest use, that'll document the peak, meaning the highest number of users authorized to use that service in the current month. So if we were to interpret this example at a very high level, we're seeing there were roughly 1,700 or so users that were authorized access to the Gold Management Cloud service. So, right off the bat, something that we would probably want to know is if this customer is actually using or intended to use the goal management functionality within Oracle Cloud. In addition to this report, if you look at the bottom of the screen where it says, how is this measured, does it matter? It does matter. Oracle provides a report that is called the Usage Drill Through Report. This is another investigative tool that can help customers look into usage. It includes the users and the roles and the privileges that are assigned. It actually shows you how it relates to each SKU in the subscription. So overall, there are tools that customers can use that are provided by Oracle, but again, it's not just as simple as pulling the report and you have your answer, right? There's going to be a level of human investigation and diligence and discovery to actually interpret the data and understand the business context behind it. But again, these reports are nifty tools and they're definitely a good starting point to glean certain insights. You can kind of see some trends or themes. You can see where you're over or underutilizing expected or unexpected services. Moving into the next slide, we are going to go through how you could, in theory, quantify a hypothetical scenario. So the snippet of the report is what you saw on the last slide. That's the SaaS usage metrics report. So if we look at this here, it looks like there were around 2,000 or so hosted named users for the month of December that were authorized to use the Enterprise Contracts Cloud service. So in theory, let's say that we reviewed the roles and their privileges. We've attributed it to a custom inquiry role that was provided to the entire enterprise. So if you remember what Ryan said, it's a common misconception that inquiry does not trigger licenses. We can see here that it absolutely does. So if we actually take that 2,000, we can multiply it by the monthly subscription price for that service of $150. Let me backtrack a little. Where we got that $150 is Oracle publishes a public list price for each service, and that can be used to potentially quantify the anticipated cost. And we've provided a snippet of the cost for the service below. So if you take that 2,000, multiply it by that monthly subscription price of $150, and again, we really want to preface and caveat and say this is just a baseline. Most customers negotiate different numbers based on, the inception of their contract agreement. But that's really coming out to approximately $350,000 a month in unexpected costs. So it's definitely not chump change, but it really just reinforces the importance of regular ongoing reconciliation and review of licensing. One thing I do want to say though is the goal is not necessarily to get to zero for unexpected usage, but it's really to reduce where possible and where it's viable. So we implore a lot of our customers to really take inventory of what Oracle Cloud functionality is being used at the enterprise, because maybe they set out to undergo a transformation journey, move to the cloud, implement a new ERP. So really just making sure they're tapping into the functionality they've signed up for and maximizing that ROI. So I'll turn it over to Ryan. He's going to talk through some of the most common root causes that we've seen that can contribute to these numbers.
Sure. Thanks, Natalie. We can't. Oh, perfect. Already on the right slide. Like Natalie mentioned, so just because the nature of the licensing model is constantly evolving and security design is unique to each business, definitely would suggest a thorough assessment of license use when going through and planning either for future implementation or an existing implementation, just to make sure that you're covered from an organization perspective and a license perspective. We've listed a couple of the more common root causes we see as we've gone through and helped clients analyze and identify some of these license issues. You see these on the screen here. I'm not going to read them all back at you because a lot of them do align with some of the misconceptions I talked to earlier, but a couple to point out. So we talked about elevated access for support, but I didn't touch on legacy implementation access for users for support purposes that may have come from an implementation or from more of a managed service provider as part of Go Live. So this is just making sure that, going through and identifying any elevated access that you have and making sure that it's appropriate at this point in time versus when you implemented. We see a lot of third-party consulting companies and managed service providers, system implementers that still have access in systems, even though they're no longer engaged and working in the implementation. So that's just something to consider, even if the user is inactive, based on what we were talking to earlier. And you see that as another common theme here. If they have the roles assigned to them, they still will be triggering the corresponding licenses. In addition to that, I wanted to speak to generic accounts. So it's another common root cause we see. If you have a generic account that's associated with integration or more of a service account, if it has broad-based access, a lot of times we'll see it maintain those same job roles and corresponding privilege access from inception and not so much a point in time. Obviously, if it's an integration and it needs set access, it's hard to have a point in time provisioning process for an integration. But for a service account that's used more from a service perspective, you definitely can have a more point in time provisioning model for break glass fixes and whatnot. And then for the integration perspective, making sure you pare the integration roll down just to what the actual integration needs. And that kind of aligns with the third bucket that I don't think we really touched on a lot as part of the misconception slide, and that's the redundant or excessive design and provisioning bucket. Just generally speaking, once you go through an analysis of this and you see unexpected license authorizations popping up across the board, if you do, you may just need to take a more holistic approach and make sure that your roles are designed appropriately. And if they are, that's awesome, but you still may have gaps in your provisioning process where certain roles may be handed out more commonly than not. And so maybe just ratcheting up and providing additional layers of governance on top of your provisioning process could limit some of the access that's being granted that's not needed, and that would also reduce your license impact. A common example of that would be the inquiry role or inquiry roles that you may need. And a lot of times those are provisioned very commonly to a broad-based user base. And if they are, you're inherently triggering all of those licenses for the privileges that the inquiry role has access to, regardless of whether it's transactional or not. So just a couple other examples of generic root causes we've seen across clients. That's not to say that there aren't others. There definitely are. Each business is unique, so there are more nuanced requirements you would need to gather to make sure that as part of a more holistic and robust remediation plan, that you're considering everything appropriately. I also would like to say that you should definitely prioritize these. Big bang is not always the best way if you're looking at this from how do I tackle and fix. A good remediation plan would include a prioritization based on cost savings, business impact, level of effort, and access risk, tying it all the way back to making sure that if you're going to go through an exercise to clean stuff up, make sure you're considering any kind of SOD and sensitive access risk. A, just to make sure you're not creating any new access risk, but B, also potentially bundling in some cost savings around cleaning up that aspect of your access provisioning as well, if you find that you need to do that. And it can kind of be done in tandem a lot of times with a lot of synergies. With that said, I think that kind of covers the root causes we generally see. And I think that generally covers most of the aspects of a thorough license review, the impact, the cost implications that Natalie alluded to as well. So in conclusion, just to kind of sum this up, it's never a bad time to review your license posture, because especially at the current time we're in as a global society, everybody's trying to cut costs and potentially find ways to improve the bottom line from the macro environment and the organization perspective. With that said, there are several times that it does make sense to pause and do an intentional license review. One of those would be before an implementation. So just thinking through this before you've actually purchased modules, if you know essentially what you need, take the time to negotiate with Oracle and make sure that you're purchasing the correct license allocation for your business. It will definitely save you in the long run, and it'll set you up to at least understand any future implications that you're going to incur if you choose to use out-of-the-box roles, or whether you choose to plan to customize your roles. Second scenario would be during an implementation. So even if you have already negotiated with Oracle before you've purchased Oracle and started implementing, make sure that as part of your security design, you're going through and doing a thorough review of your license implication once you've come up with your future state. Because like I mentioned before, a lot of times in the security design, you'll copy inherent roles and then customize or pare down access from there. Knowing the implications of licensing up front, it may adjust your approach there, and you may more significantly reduce some of that access so that you're not getting dinged after go live with unexpected license costs. The third major bucket would be during cutover and go live. So again, whether or not you've considered this before you implemented, and hopefully you have already looked at license implication during your security design, during cutover and go live, do a sanity check just to make sure that nothing got through the cracks. A, from a job role and security design perspective, but B, also from a user mapping perspective and user role assignment perspective. Because a lot of times at go live, if you don't do a thorough review of that, people will end up going into production with access that you didn't necessarily intend them to. It could also lend itself to some access risk, but at its premise, just because you weren't planning for it, it may have unexpected license implications as well. And as soon as it's in production, it's fair game for your next Oracle billing cycle, as far as when they audit and when they consider you having that license authorized for billing. And then just generally speaking, if you already have a user access review cycle and protocol in place, just tag this on to part of that cycle. That way, even if you've got everything clean currently and everything is authorized as intended from a license perspective, you at least have a routine sanity check to make sure that nothing's popped up. There hasn't been any provisioning events since your last user access review that could have a potential impact in your next billing cycle. And that's just more or less of a best practice going forward now that we're all aware of the nuances and eccentricities of the Oracle licensing model. So with that said, I don't have anything else from my perspective. I definitely hope that was informative, and I know Natalie does too for you all. As far as the do's and don'ts of Oracle Cloud licensing, you'll see on this slide here, we do have some additional thought leadership on other Oracle topics that you're welcome to peruse. You'll get this presentation after the webinar. When it's sent out, so you'll be able to access those links and navigate to those. But if you do have any additional questions regarding this topic around Oracle licensing, our contact information is on one of the first slides. Feel free to reach out to Natalie or myself, and we'll be happy to talk further with you on that. But with that said, I think we're going to pan over and take questions, but I'll turn it back over to you, Stephanie and Holly.
Thank you so much for your presentations, Natalie and Ryan. Again, if you have any questions, please add them now into the question box. And while we wait for those to come in, we just wanted to say that if you do have any questions, please email either Ryan or Natalie, or you can email events@pathlock.com and we can make sure we get the questions to the appropriate people. With that, I don't see any questions for right now, so I just wanted to thank everyone for coming, and we hope to see you at future events.